And we're back with Kevin Alschuler. Kevin, this is the first time we've ever had a psychologist on our podcast. So this is an exciting day. For people that aren't familiar with you, can you just tell us who you are and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope I don't ruin it for all the other psychologists that you have in the future, but we'll do our best to set the stage here. So I am a psychologist primarily at the University of Washington. I work in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine. So as I know your audience probably more than most would know, we kind of cover all injury and illness recovery from traumatic injuries to neurologic diseases to sports injuries and so forth. We have nearly 30 psychologists now in our department. We work with our inpatient rehabilitation teams and in our outpatient multidisciplinary clinics. And, our role is to really, try to cover a few things with our patient groups. So one is to improve function, right? So that's what we're all trying to do on the rehab side, and we're here to help address the psychological factors that impact function. But obviously also as psychologists, we're trying to help with well-being, quality of life, social engagement, social participation, and so forth. I've spent much of my career here working with our patients living with multiple sclerosis. More recently, I moved into the athletic department, so I'm doing more sport-focused work. I've done a lot of sport and performance work outside of the university as well, so it's just been kind of a natural transition. But I've gone from the world, at least on the rehab side of things, from the world of progressive neurologic disease to ACL tears and Achilles tears and then all the smaller injuries that feel huge to athletes who expect to be able to participate every day.
Yeah, at some point throughout this conversation, I would love to hear just the reflections you've had of being on kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum, like you just noted. And the topics we're going to dive into, it's kind of three main areas that is kind of your clinical interests and some of your background and what you manage probably on a daily and a weekly basis. So uncertainty, coping in pain, and resilience are these three big things that we're going to try to dive into and hear your perspective from a psychologist standpoint. The first one is uncertainty. One, why are you so interested in uncertainty, and really what does that mean, and where should we kind of start when we think about this from a clinical rehab standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I first became super interested in uncertainty because of my work with our patients with multiple sclerosis. The listeners who don't know, MS is essentially a progressive condition that impacts patients in really different ways in terms of the symptom profile, the rate of progression, and so forth. And so living with an MS diagnosis means that you're living with a ton of uncertainty. And what we were seeing clinically was patients coming in with a variety of kind of presentations in terms of being anxious or being depressed or, seeming to have a lot of questions for their provider or whatever it might be. But when we kind of took a step back and we looked at it, we said the root of all of this for a lot of our patients is they don't know what the path is in front of them. And so that's how I became interested in kind of examining what was already out there and what was already understood about coping with uncertainty, and then getting involved with how we might translate that to MS specifically.
Yeah, a condition like MS, there's, like you just said, a ton of uncertainty, but this can go across the spectrum of any type of injury and diagnosis and presentation.
Yeah.
And I would be curious to hear your thoughts from an uncertainty standpoint on the patient side, but then also clinician uncertainty of trying to come up with management options and answers and addressing some of the inherent uncertainty and being okay with that. I'll let you kind of decide where you want to start, but what are
Sure.
some kind of reflections and recommendations you have from a patient standpoint of managing uncertainty, and then from a clinician side of discussing it, and then clinically the inherent uncertainty? I know that's a lot, but I'll let you
No,
take it
that's
wherever
great.
you want.
That's great. And I think you're absolutely correct that, yes, MS was the starting point for me, but this applies everywhere. And, one of the things that happened for us was we started our MS focused uncertainty work in 2015, 2016. We had pretty good idea and understanding of that piece by 2019, and then COVID hit in 2020, and we looked at it and we said, and I actually did this. I could take a presentation on uncertainty in MS and just change it to COVID, and I could give the same presentation, right? And so it's definitely a topic that translates across a wide variety of things we experience, and not necessarily just within injury or illness, but across all things in our lives. So, Chris, maybe a good starting point to build off of for all those pieces that you laid out is just to talk about uncertainty in general and kind of what our framework and understanding is. So, in general, people don't like uncertainty, right? We like to know what's in front of us. And I often say to people, if we had kind of these three options in front of us, I think it would go in this direction. A person would want to know things are about to go well. The next thing is they'd want to know things aren't going to go well. And then the third thing is they would want to be in a situation where they don't know how things are going to go, right? Like we don't tolerate that third option very well. So there was research that I came across in 2015-ish that already existed on more from the mental health literature on this idea of how people cope with uncertainty. And the terminology at that point was the concept was the intolerance of uncertainty. So the idea was that none of us love uncertainty, right? It's uncomfortable to all of us. But for some people, it is more uncomfortable than others. So some people can have that uncertainty. It can be unpleasant. It can make them uneasy. And they can just have it sit there and they can go on about their day. They might not want it. They might not like it, but it's just there and they move on, right? And those are the people we probably all admire the most in terms of how they cope with uncertainty. But a lot of people are more intolerant of uncertainty, and this is varying degrees on a continuum. And what we typically see is that pushes people in one of two directions that are both geared at trying to get away from the unpleasantness of uncertainty. So one end is the people who stick their head in the sand and try to pretend there's no uncertainty in their world. And that works great in the short term, right? Because I get to stop thinking about the uncertainty. I get to stop feeling uncomfortable about it. But like all things avoidance, the uncertainty doesn't go away, right? And eventually that person is likely to have to face this thing that they've been avoiding anyway. And potentially at a cost, right? Because maybe they missed opportunities to make it better because their head was in the sand. So for our MS patients, it might be rather than deal with the uncertainty, I'm just not going to go to my appointments. And then I don't have to talk about the fact that we don't know where this is headed, right? And that feels good in the moment, but maybe now they didn't get on a medication that could have helped to make things better in the long run. The other end of the continuum, which tends to be the more common one to land people in my office, is people try to control the uncontrollable, right? Which typically shows up as worry, right? So they're thinking a lot about what's going on. They're trying to come up with solutions. It might feel like problem solving, which is why we like to do it. But if it's a truly uncertain or uncontrollable situation, right, we aren't solving anything. We're just putting a lot of time and energy into it. And it's good to be thoughtful about things. It's good to solve problems. Like, I'm not opposed to any of those things. But there is a cost to thinking about those things endlessly, right? And that cost is your time and your energy, right? And you could be putting that into other things, right? And ideally, those other things would be things that are adding to your life instead of pulling away from your life. So I think we could probably build off of that framework to answer some of those questions that you had, because I think if we look at individuals, if we look at providers, right, like we are all living in that space of what I was talking about, between coexisting with the uncertainty and doing those two things, avoidance or worry, that tend to be our efforts to eliminate the unpleasantness of the uncertainty.
Do you have any ideas as to why people fall into those areas of tolerating it really well and managing it well, sticking their head in the sand, and then extreme kind of worry and anxiety and trying to control the uncontrollable? How do people end up in those three spots?
Yeah, so I often get this question, and often is presented in a kind of nature versus nurture question, right? Like, are people just this way? Or, you know, I know Johnny, and Johnny's just like so relaxed about everything, and, you know, what is it that allows him to be that way, or what have you? I think this is honestly like most things in life. Like, we are probably born a certain way, right? That starts us at a point on this continuum. And then as we live and have our life experiences and are raised certain ways and so forth, we move from that spot, right? So if you're born as a worrier, right, this might get better, right? And we can probably learn how to make it better, right? But that was your starting point. If you were born as a person who is able to better coexist with these things, and you grow up in an environment where people just roll with it, right, you're probably more likely to be able to stay in that space. But I think one of the things that's been interesting to us as clinicians and as people who try to help people have better experiences in their lives is to examine, you know, what are those opportunities? How can we help people move towards what we think is that healthier space of being able to coexist with the uncertainty?
Yeah, so maybe we start on that one end of sticking the head in the sand, this avoidance of uncertainty for those individuals, and whether it's the patient avoiding uncertainty or the clinician and the provider avoiding the uncertainty. And we talk about this a lot in other episodes of individuals where they're, from a rehab standpoint, they don't want to embrace just a lot of the unknowns of management and of outcomes. And so they just stick with clear, simple, black and white answers, black and white solutions, even though a lot of times that's really not the case. So from a clinician and a patient standpoint, those individuals sticking their head in the sand, how can we kind of get to a healthier spot of uncertainty?
Yeah. So first off, I'll just say, like, it is always an uphill climb when the thing we're doing is reinforced by what's right in front of us. And what we want to do is more the long term, right? So with avoidance, right, as soon as we avoid, we feel better because the discomfort is gone, right? And the things that I think we all recognize would be beneficial about not avoiding come later, right? They're longer term things. So this is always a challenge with avoidance, that there's the pull to avoidance is like subject to this very immediate reinforcement. What I typically find, though, is that, you know, the first thing that we need to help people with is just being able to better manage the distress that they're feeling, right? Because that is what that impulse is, right? The impulse is, you know, like, this doesn't feel very good, right? Like, I don't know what's going on. It's uncomfortable. It makes me nervous. I feel uneasy. And so I have to make it stop, right? And that's why they jump to putting their head in the sand, right? Like, make it stop. And so one set of skills that we work on with people is having a better ability to what we would say in our psychology language is to sit with that discomfort, right? To allow it to be there without feeling like we have to do something about it. And that means, like, we have an array of skills. You and I could spend hours on this, right? But this is everything from kind of the popular stuff now, like mindfulness and meditation, right? And skills like that teach us to be able to coexist with what's in our world, to things like our traditional approaches, cognitive behavioral therapy, where we help people better manage the way they're thinking about things, right? Find alternative ways to think about the situation, because maybe they're jumping to the most catastrophic thought and that's why they want to get away from it, right? Is like every time I think about the uncertainty, like this happens with MS, our patients will say, every time I think about this, I think about that I might not be able to walk and I'm going to be in a wheelchair, right? And then I'm going to lose my independence. And that's possible, but that's not a 90% chance in the MS community, right? And so helping our patients be able to reframe that, to see that concern or that threat in a different way is helpful. And then we have acceptance-based approaches, which are kind of blend that mindfulness based perspective with the cognitive behavioral therapy piece in terms of being able to coexist with the thoughts that we're having, not fighting off everything, being able to allow them to be there, understanding how to have thoughts without buying into every thought that we have as well. So for a lot of people, the first thing is that control of that initial impulse and finding other pathways to managing it. And I think the second piece for people is once we can get over that hump, then it's finding, what are the alternatives, right? So I said earlier that when we avoid, we often miss out on the opportunities to make our life better, right? And so if we stop avoiding, then we need to figure out how are we going to make our life better, right? So what are the things that we could be doing, that we could be engaging with? And those could be things within our health, right? So participating better in treatment, things like that. But also could just be life things, right? Like if I stop spending all my time trying to fight off the things I'm worried about, right? I could go out and, participate in an activity I enjoy, or be with this group of people I enjoy, or things like that, because avoidance actually takes work, right? Like it takes effort to not think about things, right? And if we took all that energy, all that effort, and put it into things that make our life better, that's probably a more productive use of what we're trying to do.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, this controlling the uncontrollables, are there similar thoughts and strategies as to the opposite of avoidance, or what it changes in those instances?
Yeah, so definitely that whole distress tolerance piece is probably very similar, right? Like, can we have the discomfort without feeling like we need to fix it, right? So that it might look different on the two ends, but ultimately it's that same goal. But then the other difference is, can we just rein in the time spent on worrying, right? Like what I see a lot in health conditions, and there's actually studies on this, is people who are more at that end of the continuum will spend a lot more time trying to find the solution that doesn't exist, right? One more Google search, right? One more attempt to, find some person who's had some obscure treatment somewhere else, right? Like things like that are well intended, right? But if there legitimately isn't a solution yet to this problem, it's not going to get us anywhere. And there's research on the rate of Google searches for health problems based on how tolerant or intolerant a person is of uncertainty. And it wouldn't surprise you that the more intolerant folks spend more time searching for answers, right? So we don't need to eliminate that. I think there is good in understanding your condition, understanding your options, and so forth, right? But it's trying to rein it in, right? So maybe putting boundaries, time parameters, things like that. Again, with that idea, like we talked about with the avoidance piece, of can we free you up to get back into doing the things that add to your life? What we're trying to do with all of these health conditions is we're trying to leave the problem at the size that it is, right? So I often say to our MS patients, like, there are things related to your health that may be a problem for you, right? Like, it may be a challenge to, have your ability to walk, be impacted, or your fatigue or your pain, or, all these important symptoms. What we want to make sure is we aren't artificially making it bigger by the ways that we're reacting to it. We might not be able to make it smaller, but I want to make sure we're not making it bigger. Right?
Yeah, it seems very relevant to the rehab, the physio side, with this kind of learned or conditioned response that patients may have where they're experiencing persistent pain, and a lot of times the providers they go to are also instilling this message of like, I have an answer, or we're trying to get these quick fixes, or trying to cure your persistent pain. And they've seen dozens of providers and tried dozens of treatments, and they're still years or decades later experiencing symptoms, and it's frustrating. But it's not helpful when they're going to clinicians that are trying to portray certainty and answers, when for a lot of instances with pain and chronic disease and illness, like, there may not be answers from at least a pain perspective. So it's really challenging, and trying to be the clinician that's trying to be honest and open that maybe there's not a clear answer. And like you said, not completely minimizing what they're dealing with and how limiting it may be for them, but also not expanding on it too much to the point where it makes them feel even more fragile or fearful or limited. And it is a delicate balance, and it is hard as a clinician to try to manage that, listening and understanding and validating, but also promoting. We have strategies to help you, and this goes into the next thing, probably coping, but to move forward and to live your life in spite of or with persistent pain. And I think it feels like it's more accepted in the psychological realm of like not trying to immediately cure these things, but trying to help and guide and manage through this. And on the PT side, a lot of the narrative is we need to fix this, or this can be cured, or this, this pain can be resolved. And a lot of times it's not. I don't think I have a question from that, but it feels very relevant to our world as well. Do you have any recommendations for clinicians with patients that are coming in looking for answers, ways to have some of those discussions to bring up, the tolerance or okay being not having pure answers?
Absolutely. There is a line of research that exists. I wish I had the person's name at my fingertips here, but on this same set of concepts, but for providers, right? Because as providers or as clinicians, we face a lot of the same things, right? There's the uncertainty of the patient's condition, right? But there's also the uncertainty of whether the treatment I'm going to offer is going to work, right? And there's a lot of the same discomforts, right? The person's coming to you for answers, and, what if you don't have that answer, right? What do you do, right? And so we're prone to the same things, right? Do we avoid answering that question? Do we throw an answer out there so that it feels like we've given an answer, right? Or are we able to call it what it is, right? And where there's uncertainty, be able to just acknowledge that uncertainty. But I think for a lot of clinicians, and I might have expertise in uncertainty, but I'm sure I fall into this as well. Like, it's hard to just respond to the uncertainty by saying, yeah, we don't know, right? Because you want to help the person feel better. You feel that discomfort that's there across from you. I think one of the things that we all could do better patients and clinicians is take these big uncertain things and break them into smaller pieces. There's almost always things that we can do something about, and there's almost always things that we can't. And I think sometimes we think we see it all as one big thing. So it's all just one pile of uncertainty, for example. But the reality is there's almost always things that we can take control of and we can do, right? And we want to control those controllables within reason, of course, but like if there's stuff we can do, let's go do it, right? Let's put that energy, that desire to make it better into those pieces. And if we're taking it more in those bite-sized pieces, then it's also easier to say, okay, there's this piece that we don't know, right? We don't know what we can do about it. But now we've broken it into enough pieces that maybe there's 10 pieces and 7 of them we have something to do something about and 3 we don't know. That's easier for all of us to sit with, right? Instead of letting those 3 kind of cloud the entire picture and having us go, oh, we don't know what's going to happen, you know?
Do you have examples of common bite-sized pieces that you'll discuss with patients or clients, and kind of giving them the options of kind of where do you want to start, or here are some places we could begin that are more approachable?
Absolutely. So this one will be music to your ears, but I think there's always an opportunity to engage in your rehab, right? So the effort that you put into, you know, or the effort you put into doing the work to get better, right? So, you know, if we get out of MS, we think about like our athletes who are returning from an ACL tear, right? Like, we don't know if you're going to be as good as you were before, right? You might be better, right? Like, there are those stories too, but like, we don't know. That's something that's 6, 9, 12 months away, right? But what we do know is there's stuff you can do today that helps you get better for the future, right? And so trying to identify what those things are while being able to hold that long-term uncertainty out there is productive, right? Easier said than done, right? It's easy for the two of us to sit here and say those things, but people almost always have things they can do, right? And the same person with the ACL, you know, also probably could be optimizing their sleep. They probably also could be eating better. They probably also could be making sure they're spending time with friends and people who care about them. They probably also could be, you know, if it's an athlete, like engaging with their sport in different ways. Like I work a lot with football. They probably always needed to watch more film. Now they have more time to watch more film, right? Like, so we can build out all kinds of things to do that are all in service to self-improvement, even if there's a piece of us that's an unknown, right? And so we try to build those pieces, help people develop some structure that they can lean on that's built around doing things that are productive.
Yeah, it to me at least, the post-operative or these more return to sport or physically demanding cases of rehab, it seems like those opportunities and discussions are a little bit more objective or like tangible. Mm-hmm. What I struggle with commonly is the patients where they're just struggling with persistent pain, and maybe they're really active, or, you know, they have this boom bust if they do things for a while and then become really sedentary, and their sole pursuit is, I just want to get rid of my pain. Mm-hmm. And trying to reorient to how do we manage the valued activities you are doing or are avoiding with some level of symptoms. That's where it just gets so much murkier for me, and messy. So do you have any thoughts on those instances where it's not we're going back to sport, but we're still trying to find these digestible wins?
Yeah, and I started my career working with patients with low back pain who are exactly like you just totally described what that experience was like. And if we want to talk about pain, I mean, you know, pain is one that, chronic pain specifically, is one that's really tricky for people because, you know, as we all know, we our kind of instinct around pain is typically to see it as harmful. And with chronic pain, a lot of times our patients aren't really at risk of further harm, right? But they obviously are facing discomfort and the risk of continued or ongoing discomfort. So we spend a lot of time helping our patients, change that battle of, is it pain, is pain gonna win or is my life gonna win, right? This kind of, it's the pain or it's my function, right? This either or. And we try to move more towards an and approach, right? That we could have pain and we can function, right? That they don't have to be pitted against each other, right? So in that first either or approach, it's I can't have pain, right? Pain is bad, pain is a barrier, pain is the reason I can't do things, right? And so we get into a very close-minded approach, right? Where the whole focus becomes eliminating the pain so that I can do these other things that I want to do. In our and approach, right, it becomes, can we find ways to do things despite the pain, right? Despite the discomfort. And not seeing it in this kind of like, if I have pain, I can't do any of the things that I want to do. Now, we're careful with this because we all know pain is uncomfortable, right? We're not saying that a person living with chronic pain should feel like they can do all the things they could do before, right? But if you think back to what I said a few minutes ago, that question of, are we making the problem bigger than it already is? I think that's where we see this opportunity, right? That when we get in the fighting against the pain piece, we tend to also make the challenge even bigger, or we tend to get even farther away from the things that we want to be doing.
This probably seems like a good transition into coping, which is what you're describing. Is that coping, or what is coping?
Great question. So in layman's terms, we often say it's how we're dealing with having this challenge, having this problem. For most of us who work in rehabilitation psychology, when we think of coping, it's what skills and what strategies does a person have available to them to better manage the challenge that's in front of them. So if it's pain, right? Like, what skills and strategies does the person have available to better manage the pain? And then if they are coping, it means they are using those skills and strategies, hopefully effectively, to better manage that challenge that's in front of them.
And is there a range of healthier and maybe unhealthy coping options?
Yeah, absolutely. So we often talk about, and I guess that's a very important point you just brought up. I painted the rosy side of this, but we often talk about adaptive and maladaptive coping, right? So adaptive coping is the set of strategies we use that help us, right? And they might help with those things I said at the very beginning, with function, with well-being, with quality of life. And the one that I didn't mention at that point would also be with managing the symptom itself, right? So with improving our pain or our fatigue or whatever the symptom might be. And then maladaptive coping, should be obvious at this point, is the opposite, right? So it's the things that we do that make things worse, right? What I often caution in these things is most maladaptive coping that people do is not intentional, right? Like, they didn't do it because they want to sabotage what's going on or something like that. In fact, it's almost always the other way, right? They're doing these things for well-intended reasons, right? They're trying to make the pain go away. They're trying to get through the day. They're trying whatever it is, but it might unintentionally be maladaptive in terms of the fact that it is making their function worse, that it's causing their life, their well-being, their quality of life, their symptom intensity to all worsen.
Yeah, what are the most common, either in the MS world or on the other side, the athletic and the collegiate sport setting that you're in as well? What are the coping strategies that you see as maladaptive, and then ways you're trying to develop these adaptive coping options?
Absolutely. So I think our favorite one to pick on as psychologists is catastrophizing, which is the one that I referenced earlier, where we are jumping to the most catastrophic situation, right? I will never be able to do this thing, or I'll never feel good enough to do whatever, or right? And the thing with catastrophizing is it's always rooted in the truth, right? And what we have is we have our standard probability of outcomes, right? And there is a worst case outcome that could happen, right? Statistically, it's probably 0.1% or 0.001%, right? But it's a really scary, really bad outcome, right? So it grabs our attention, and what we see in catastrophizing is kind of an over-representation of the likelihood of that thing happening. So that is by far our favorite one to pick on as psychologists. I'm sure as we go, we'll talk about kind of ways that our other strategies help with overcoming the catastrophizing piece. But there are others. I think a big one we come across in pain management, that I know the other rehab providers come across as well, is this feeling that if I'm in pain, I can't or shouldn't do anything, right? And so the inactivity, the deactivation, and then kind of the whole cycle that gets into as well. And so certainly, again, that's one that comes from a great, reasonable perspective, right? I bent over to pick up a box and my back hurt, so now I shouldn't bend over and pick up a box. Makes sense, right? But the next thing is maybe I shouldn't bend over, right? At all, ever, right? And we start to see those things grow, right? And so in the pain world, in the work I've done in pain, we see a lot of that, of just this shrinking of activity, right? So if we know this, set of activities is bad, I'm going to do a little less, right? And then that no longer feels safe enough, so I'm going to do a little less, right? And it just gets smaller and smaller. And so that's certainly another big one. And we have many more, but I think those are a couple examples of big ones that we face.
Yeah, I've had previous conversations with patients the past few months where they've tried that approach, where they're symptomatic to something. So position and activity, they remove that, and then over a few weeks or months or years, they've removed everything. And they're still super symptomatic for whatever they're dealing with, but now they can't, for what they perceive, they can't do anything. And there's an individual that I'm working with remotely who has Achilles tendon pain, tendinopathy, and started at the job that he was working, removed himself from the job because he didn't feel like he could tolerate it, became more and more sedentary, and rarely left his house because he was so concerned about his Achilles tendon pain. And we had this discussion of, well, you've tried the approach of removing all of the irritable activities, and how has that worked out? You're now not able to do anything. And what are your thoughts of us slowly reintegrating into activities that may be a little bit uncomfortable, but kind of moving in the opposite direction? And it's really sad to see when people are in that space where they funneled their life so much and it's so limiting, and then trying to get them slowly out of that activity or that, headspace. That initial catastrophizing, like you said, is the most common that psychologists like to talk about. What are the ways to not catastrophize or to manage the idea of catastrophication?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing with catastrophizing is we don't necessarily need to eliminate it. Remember what I said was it's on the menu of options, right? It's just a small percentage option. And so it comes back to this idea of, can we help people be able to have thoughts, have feelings, have reactions to things without then latching on to them, because like catastrophizing, for example, wins because it's the loudest thing in the room, right? Tends to be the scariest thing, so it grabs our attention. But can we have that thought and be able to say, like, yeah, like that is possible, right? But we don't know that that's going to be the case, or that is possible, but so are all these other things, right? And so sometimes we look at with people at like, what are the likely outcomes? What is the evidence that one's going to happen over the other, right? Like things like that, just trying to restore order, right? Like we're trying to get things back into a realistic frame, right? And so one thing with catastrophizing is I think a lot of times people feel like either they latch onto it or they feel like they have to talk themselves out of it. And it's like, it's on, like I said earlier, it's on the menu of options, right? It is something that's available. But what we're trying to come back to is that uncertainty stuff we talked about before, right? Like we don't know that thing's going to happen because we don't know what's going to happen, right? So can we just leave it there? Can we leave that as an unanswered question and go back to the things that we can do something about? So here's an example. When I worked in back pain, this is actually one of the first patients I ever had in my career. It was this gentleman. He was a really hard worker. His job was very physical in nature. Like everything he did was physical, and he had really bad back pain. So this was back in Michigan. He was off work because of his back pain. It was the fall. There's lots of leaves in Michigan, and he said, "All right, like I have to do something productive. I have to feel productive." He goes. He rakes his whole lawn, picks up all the leaves, feels good about that, and he ends up in bed for 2 weeks because of his back pain. Right? So he comes in and we talk about it, and I said to him, we might be able to approach this in a different way, right? Like we might be able to still pick up those leaves, right? But in a way that isn't going to result in you being in bed for 2 weeks. And we went back and forth over this whole thing, which was like, we sorted out, how long do you think you could do it without ending up in bed? Right? And we got down to, I don't know, it was something like a quarter of his yard, right? And then he was like, well, what idiot does, only picks up a quarter of the leaves in their yard, And we went through this whole thing and, became a math question, right? You did 1 day of picking up leaves and you spent 14 days in bed, right? So that's 15 days. Or we could do a quarter of the yard a day for 4 straight days. Or maybe even every other day. So maybe it takes us 8 days, right? Which, as far as I can tell, is less than 15 days, right? But getting the mind around that is the challenge, right? Like, is it what I'm supposed to do? Is it okay? Is it socially acceptable? Can I live with doing it that way? Can I get myself to stop? Right? Like, there's a lot of psychology that's behind just making that decision to approach things in a different way. So we feel like we play a big role in trying to help people become more flexible in their thinking. Right? If we can get out of that rigidity of things have to be a certain way, we often have options to make our life better. And so that is a concrete example of how we do that, right? But that's something that we're always trying to help our patients, whether it's with uncertainty, whether it's with pain, fatigue, their prognosis, whatever it might be, is can we, inject some level of flexibility, right? Some ability to find different solutions, different ideas, different ways forward that might produce a different result. We're very rigid, and when we're under stress, when things seem hard, when things seem challenging, we tend to double down on that rigidity, right? And most of the opportunity is in finding ways that are new or different and being more flexible.
Let's transition to resilience, another area that you really enjoy talking about and have researched in the past. What is resilience?
Yeah, so funny you should ask that, because we did a study at one point to try to improve the definition of resilience, because there are many definitions. But one of the ones that I like the most, which is not our definition but is reflected in our definition, is that resilience is our ability to bounce back and thrive in the face of adversity. And the reason that I like that is it covers three things that are kind of central to resilience. One is we typically think of resilience in the context of adversity, right? So it's how we're handling something difficult in our lives. The second is we almost always think of resilience in terms of if you got knocked down, how well were you able to get back up, right? So that's the bouncing back part. But the part that I really love is the and thrive element of that definition as well. I think when we think of resilience, we're not just thinking, did you get knocked down and did you get back up? But it's then what, right? Then what did you do, right? And I think that's a really important part for us in psychology about this concept of resilience, is we want to help people handle the challenges, handle the adversity that's in front of them. But we also want to help people get better from it and grow and you know, along the lines of things we've said earlier, function better, live better, have better quality of life, and so forth.
How are you all measuring resilience? And again, to maybe that initial like nature nurture, how much of this is just a developed trait and can that be changed over time?
Yeah, so there's a number of essentially paper and pencil measures. This is always, I don't know if I'd say we get criticized for it. It's always a challenge, at least in our field of psychology. We don't have a lot of ways to measure what's going on between the ears, right, other than to ask people and have them tell us. But we have different resilience measures. Some are more specific to an activity or a problem, and others are more general of you know, what an individual does in the face of challenges in life, adversity in life. So it's more of kind of a global measure of how resilient an individual is. In terms of your question, like, yeah, I think I see most things in this kind of hybrid nature-nurture perspective of people start somewhere, and for the most part, we can help them move to somewhere better. And that starting point, you know, whether it's how they were born or it's a combination of the genetics and how they were raised, you know, from birth and so forth, I'm not sure we can always tease that piece apart, but by the time a person comes to us, it's pretty clear that they're at a spot. But the research definitely in all the spaces we've talked about, but resilience being one of them, definitely supports that we can teach skills and strategies to help a person demonstrate more resilience, which I think then we would look at them and say they are more resilient, right? And I think that's an important part actually that I didn't mention in the definition as well, is resilience isn't like a thing, right? Resilience is a constellation of things, right? It's how we handle the challenge. It's what our skills and abilities are to respond to that challenge, right? Like there's lots and lots of pieces. So it's what we think of as a construct, right? It's a concept that's made up of lots of different pieces and lots of different elements. And so when we think of growing resilience, when we think of helping people be more resilient, right, that's not a global thing, right? It's our ability to impact the right pieces within that constellation of pieces that then contributes to this big picture of what resilience is, right? So some people need to handle the adversity better. Some people need to be able to find the way forward better. Some, you know, like it just varies from person to person in terms of what those pieces are. And this is why the resilience literature is vast, because I think everybody looks at it through a different lens or at different variables that all are part of the big picture story of resilience.
This is switching topics a little bit, but I've seen you on TV on the sidelines of UW football games, and I'm very curious if you're implementing strategies or having some of these discussions with athletes in real time during a football game. Have you done that over the past season? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting. I get asked these things a lot and I'm like, oh, it's all the same. All the settings, it's all the same. Like that's my easy answer. I think that when you see that piece, right, when we're on the sidelines at a game, there's a couple things. One is I don't want to be in a position where a guy needs me to be there, right? I want that to be a luxury, right? Something where we're able to be there and able to add something. But ideally, we've already taught the skills, taught the strategies, right? The athlete is ready to be there. So when we're there, it's not for them to be dependent on us. But ideally, I've already done the work that I know the athletes, right? We've had discussions. I know what things those athletes are working on. And so if the moment presents itself, I can be a reminder system in that moment, right? And so the vast majority of our work on the sidelines, in the dugout, like on game day, is reminding athletes of things that we've already worked on, right? Or building off of those pieces. Now, ideally, again, we know the athletes well enough that if something comes up, they're having a bad day, they got injured, whatever it is, there's enough familiarity that maybe we can jump in and help a little bit with how they're managing that situation as well. A big part of my role in athletics that's very different than the role we play clinically is spending a lot of time getting to know the people, right? And clinically we get to know the people. I sit with the patient for hours on end, but when we do that clinically, there's like a structure to it, right? You're getting to know them, you're providing intervention, you're teaching skills. There's a lot more in this setting of just getting to know people so that when they need you, you're familiar with them, they're familiar with you, right? And there's that opportunity to jump in. And it's a lot more of the kind of the micro interventions, right? 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 10 minutes while they're on the training table, like whatever it might be, but it's a lot more bite-sized than what we're used to in our kind of classic 50-minute hour in a clinical setting.
Yeah, is your role throughout the course of a season or a year that any of the athletes have accessibility to you to have, more of a traditional clinical psychology session, or is it you're just spending time with these teams and they can come up to you at any point? How formal or informal are some of these times?
Yeah, so we're set up here to offer all of it. I'm not the only psychologist here. There's 6 of us in the group. We all have clinic time, so I'm actually in the clinic room right now. We all have clinic time where athletes can schedule with us for traditional sessions, and that can be anything from mental health to performance. And with student athletes, there's a lot with mental health, with adjustment, with homesickness, with all the developmental pieces that we'd expect. But we have the expertise across our team to be able to offer the whole continuum clinically. And then I'm one of 2 psychologists who spend some of our time, as I like to say, in the wild. So getting to be, in the facilities with the teams. Football's the biggest piece for me in that regard. And there, what I try to do is create opportunities for players to engage. So if we think about, one of the biggest limitations for us in psychology, and this isn't even just in sport, but in general, one of the biggest limitations for us in psychology is that only a certain percentage of people are going to make an appointment and come talk to us. And what I've found is, like with our football team, most players, like I don't think this is an exaggeration, 85 to 90% of the players would have a meaningful conversation with me if I made it easy for them to have that conversation. And I think, well, we know this, fewer than 10%, maybe fewer than 5% would make an appointment to come see us in clinic. So the whole goal of being out there is to create those opportunities. And those opportunities come from talking in the hallway, the weight room, the lunch room, the training room, the locker room, right? To creating opportunities in less threatening situations, right? Team meetings, stuff like that, where we can provide information, right? And open doors that way as well. And so what we've tried to do is create a structure where people who could benefit from working with us have the opportunity to do so, and they aren't restricted to only seeing us in a clinical setting.
Is there still a stigma with athletes where they either are verbalizing directly to you, or you've just heard it from the coaches, or it's just kind of an awareness that they think that talking to a psychologist inherently is something that's, whatever the word is, lower than them, or that's, I don't know how to frame it, but is there one of the reasons they're not coming consistently because there's still that stigma of not wanting to go to a psychologist and talk to someone?
Yeah, so there's still a stigma. It is way, 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 way better than it used to be. I give the coaches a ton of credit. So the teams that I'm on the ground with, the coaches have made a concerted effort to fold what we do into the team instead of having it be that it would be, the kind of traditional way of being supportive, which was, if you need the psychologist, go see them. You just have to go down that dark hallway, right? Now, like, these coaches have done a great job of including me in what goes on. So I always bring this example up, like for football, I dress like the coaches. Like today I'm as fancy dressed as I get now, which is I have a polo on, right? But if I'm in the football building, it's running shoes, it's a hoodie, it's, dress like everybody else. We're there with everybody else. We eat with them. I go to practice, we do these things on purpose to break down those barriers. My goal is, I want them to see me as just another person who's there, who happens to have some expertise in a certain area, which would be no different than their nutritionists, their athletic trainers, their strength and conditioning staff. We don't need to be different, right? And the more we've normalized that, the better it's gotten. And some guys get it right away, right? Like the first day I was there, some players would come and chat in the hallway, and I've worked with the football program 8-7 months at this point now, and there's players who are just talking to me for the first time, right? And that I think relates to that stigma piece of how long does it take to not be uncomfortable talking to us? And I accept that some people will it's just not what they believe in, or it's not something they view as helpful, and we will never get to 100% of the athletes engaging. But we can do a lot better than the 5 to 10% in clinic.
A facility or, place like UW and other university settings and professional sport, this is becoming more and more normalized, I'm assuming. But with a lot of clinicians that are listening, they're in private practice where they may be just by themselves in a physio clinic, or maybe they're in a hospital-based system where they have access to orthos and other healthcare providers, but maybe not even a psychologist. There are so many times where I've realized that having a psychologist on board for this patient would be so beneficial, but it can be really tricky trying to bring up that type of conversation. And it is a fine line. I've become more and more comfortable with it over time, just because I've normalized it. If I don't get uncomfortable bringing it up, then it helps the process.
Mm-hmm.
What are your recommendations for healthcare providers and rehab providers in particular that realize how beneficial this could be to bring this conversation up to a patient of, I really think that this would be a great person for you to communicate with, or to help us throughout this journey, whether it's, a sports psychologist or someone, not on the sports side, but just a normal psychologist. What are your recommendations for providers having these discussions with patients?
Yeah. So what I've found is the thing that seems to scare people off is, I'm going to go see the psychologist, I'm going to have to talk about my feelings, and they're going to dig into my life, and suddenly that feels scary and that feels uncomfortable. I've had the good fortune that working in medical settings and working in sport, we have a unifying thing that's out there, right? So when I'm working with a football team, everybody in that building's goal should be for us to play better football, right? It's not to be a coach, it's not to be the greatest strength and conditioning coach, it's not to be the greatest psychologist. Hopefully we do those things in support of playing better football, but if a player is coming to me, it's because it's another way that with MS, right? It's the same thing, right? The goal is to help people live a better life with MS. And so we are another opportunity for a person to build skills, strategies, get resources, and so forth to help them live better with MS. And so my perspective has always been that that's the way that you can sell it. It's another piece of the pie, right? If your care is a giant pie chart, right? It's just another piece of the pie. It's another perspective. It's another angle. It's another way that we can help you better manage the challenge that's in front of you. I think the thing that we have to say to people along with that is there's a psychological side to whatever the thing is, right? From football to MS, right? There's a psychological side to that. So if we're suggesting a psychologist, it's not because I think you're having a problem. It's because that is part of living with this thing, or it's part of doing this activity, or whatever it might be. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be spending time on the mental side or the psychological side of it like we do on the physical side, right? So it's trying to align what we have to offer more with how we deliver all the other services.
And it does feel maybe challenging because the difficulty with access to psychologists, where maybe a lot of them in this region that this patient is living in, they're all out of network and they have to pay cash and they can't afford the services, or they don't even know how to find a psychologist. This may be so region dependent, but do you have recommendations for how patients can actually find psychologists?
Now, this is really hard. We struggle with this. So, we in rehab psychology are most uniquely positioned to help a person with the psychology of coping with their medical situation, right? Undoubtedly, we will get patients who need a psychologist, but don't necessarily need our expertise, right? Maybe they need traditional mental health care, and we're trained to provide that, but we don't need to devote our limited time and resources to that when there's other people who could. But we struggle to make that connection, right? So we certainly appreciate this challenge of finding the right person. From a purely rehab perspective, rehab psychologists are predominantly in larger medical systems, academic medical centers, and so forth. So if you're looking for a psychologist with the rehab or behavioral medicine expertise, that's almost always where you need to look to find those providers. Now, there are practices that are growing. I have some former trainees from here who have grown a private practice that's across a few different states. We're starting to see some growth outside of the traditional healthcare systems, but we're mostly looking at the larger, academic and major hospital systems. The benefit to that, of course, is insurance is more likely to cover that service, right? Not always, but more likely, because the larger systems tend to have those, tend to be a network for more healthcare systems. But obviously, the disadvantage is then it's kind of centralized around the large urban centers. Up here in Seattle, that's been a kind of big part of UW Medicine's mission, has been how do we take these types of services that are limited to like a metropolitan area like Seattle and help push them out to rural areas. And telemedicine and so forth is definitely helping with that, but it is a major problem given where we tend to be localized as a specialty.
Kevin, is there anything else with any of the topics that you want to discuss further or that we haven't touched on that you want to elaborate before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think we covered, like you had introduced at the beginning, 3 of my favorite topics to talk about. I think, the one thing that I think has shown through, but I think it's just a good, important point to reiterate here is, we are here as a resource to help people move from where they are to a better place, right? And I think that's different than how psychology is often viewed, rightly or wrongly, right? But we're not here because a person has a problem, like a psychological problem that we have to fix, right? We might, right? That's a big part of what we work on, right? But our goal is to help people move from where they are to a better place. And if that means they're in a terrible spot and we're making it less terrible, great. If it means they're in a pretty good spot and we can make it better, great. Like, to us, it's all about trying to add another dimension that can help our patients find a better place.
I think that's a perfect place to end. Kevin, thank you so much. First psychologist on. Great start to hopefully more people coming on to discuss similar topics, and just very important to have these discussions in general. So I appreciate it. We'll call it there.
Thanks for having me.